The room is slowly filling with attendees here. We'll just give it a minute to get started. So we currently have 184 of the almost 500 attendees that are expected for today. So we will virtually allow everyone to take their seats here for another minute or so, and then we'll get started. Okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty good quorum here. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. My name is Laura McGuire, and I work with the Resilience Engineering Association to coordinate the webinar series. And I'm a researcher with a tech startup who works on incident analysis. So I'm going to be moderating today's webinar, and on behalf of the REA, I want to welcome all of the participants that we have here today. We have a very diverse group of about 500 folks from all across the globe. So some of you might be joining us in your pajamas, and I think it's a testament to Sidney's work that you're willing to forego an extra hour of sleep to participate in what promises to be a very feisty and informative session today. Just in terms of logistics, please note that the talk is being recorded. So to optimize the audio quality, all of the microphones of the participants have been muted. Of course, we do want to encourage you to answer some questions throughout the session. So please use the question and answer functionality that's at the bottom of the screen. And myself and my colleague, David Provan, will be monitoring and selecting some of the questions from there. With such a large audience as we have today, we may not get to every question, but we're going to do our best to answer as many as we can. And the webinar is designed to be a kind of an informal talk, so we'll interrupt at different points in time to get some of those questions answered. Unfortunately, because there have been recent issues, if there is hacking or interruptions during this meeting, we will end the webinar and we'll record a session and then upload it to the REA website. After this talk, this session will be available freely to the public, but the slide deck is only available to members of the Resilience Engineering Association. So if you'd like to become a member of the REA, it's a small contribution and it really helps us to continue to offer content like this in the future. So without further delay, I want to hand the floor over to our speaker, Dr. Sidney Dekker from Griffith University.
Laura, thank you. Colleagues, good morning, good evening, and indeed, thank you for taking the time to be here and listen to this stuff. All right, I'm going to share my screen. So I'm going to run through here we go, boom. And Laura, let me know if you cannot see it right now.
Yeah, everything looks great. We can see your video and screen.
All right. Okay. Colleagues, I have been asked by the REA to talk about The Safety Anarchist, which is not, as many of you will hopefully know, not my latest book. This one came out, I think, in 2018, but I think I write them faster than some of you can keep up reading them. So there's no hope in that regard. But this one got, of course, a lot of attention in the community, if anything, because of its compelling title. Now, I will talk about what a safety anarchist might be in a moment, but first I'm going to show you a little bit about how these ideas came about. So a year before the book, we made this film, which I hope most of you will have seen, right? Safety Differently, which has a couple of examples from organizations that did a little bit of safety anarchism themselves, and in a guided and safe to fail way. And we'll get hopefully to a few examples of those. So that sort of empirical work inspired me to write the book. Not only the empirical work on how cool is this? Look at what these organizations are doing in terms of setting people free and not imposing all this safety nonsense on them, but also because of my concern, and that's putting it very diplomatically, about the amount of safety bureaucracy still lingering in nonsensical ways and productivity and autonomy killing ways in these organizations. So hence the book a year after that film. This is perhaps where it starts, right? If you go around workplaces and you see this hanging around, I mean, first of all, one observation is that Australians lost the apostrophe on the endeavor on their way here. But the idea that a safety officer is there to make your life really difficult is widespread and in fact global, even if you were to use apostrophes in characterizing it in the country that you are in. The fact that there's these little anthropological outcroppings across workplaces is always an indication of something interesting going on, right? And again, this is not a unique picture. You see this in other places as well, or other versions of it. This is a statistical, from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, an indication or representation of perhaps even the size and the overwhelming volume of the problem as experienced by people who need to do frontline work. These are Australian figures, the rise of Australians' compliance culture and workers. And compliance workers, we're not talking police, those are not counted in here. We are talking auditors, particularly we're talking inspectors, we're talking particularly in internal roles, safety officers. And a third of this compliance that you're looking at is safety. The rest is corporate compliance, corporate risk, financial risk, which takes in fact a big chunk, about a third also of the compliance pie, certainly since the 2008 crisis. Now, some of that is good, undoubtedly, and was necessary. And let me make a point up front very clear, right? That being a safety anarchist is not a plea for having governments retreat, because for a very simple reason, 3 out of 5 of the rules that we make in safety today are not government imposed. They're self-imposed. We make them up, right? 3 out of 5, 60%. Right. So, and in fact, I'll at least give you an allusion to a piece of research that we've just submitted that shows that the more you create free markets, the more you actually create problems with safety compliance. The more rules you create, the more unfree you make your workers. It's a huge paradox of neoliberal governance that sits behind most of this, and this rise in compliance workers. So blaming government is not going to help us at all. And making government retreat, in fact, most Western countries have been trying to do that for the last 40 years in terms of the deregulation and system regulation and self-regulation. But it doesn't help, right? More compliance gets thrown at the problem because organizations themselves internally start pursuing compliance as a solution to all kinds of their governance problems, whether real or imagined for that matter. But basically the graph shows, and if you were to extend it to today, that 1 in 10 people in this country, and this is very likely replicated across mature economies in the world, now work in compliance. It means 1 in 10 people is watching what the other 9 are doing, right? 1 in 10 is watching what the other 9 are doing. Now, if that were to free up or create productive capacity and beautifully adaptive systems and systems that are able to respond to emerging crises like the one we're in the middle of. If it were to create happy people, autonomous workers who have the freedom to pursue what they want to do because this stuff is taken care of for them by other people, great. If we were to see a dramatic drop in fatalities across sectors in the world, that would be perfect too, but we don't, right? If you look at, for example, oil and gas, the fatality rate over the past 20 years has pretty much been flat. And so And you could replicate across this across multiple worlds. So we throw more and more bureaucracy at the problem, and the problem isn't going to go away, right? So what do? Well, let's throw even more bureaucracy at the problem. Does the problem go away then? All right, so the safety anarchist then, oh, by the way, this is just a piece from Dom Cooper showing that, many of the interventions that we've had actually haven't made things safer at all in a country, this is the UK figures, that has been pretty aggressive since Maggie Thatcher in making government step out of the way. And so does compliance go down? No, compliance went up. And not only did compliance go up, none of this managed to kill fewer people. So compliance goes up, the results don't change, which means we really got to start doing something different, right? Hence the safety anarchist. Now, what type of compliance do you run across? I'm sure that some of you work with or in organizations that have a how to sit at your desk checklist, right? Now, this one is from the construction industry, right, which kills 60,000 people a year. That's one every 9 minutes, right? So that's a bunch during this talk alone. Very few of them behind a desk, right? That's not where you die. And yet 4 pages of this get inserted into this organization in order to probably avoid all kinds of worker compensation claims because my lower back hurts. Well, we told you to sit differently, so don't come, try to get money from us because you screwed this up. And that is, of course, behind a lot of the compliance that we see today. It is not about safety. It is not about compliance as a goal in itself. It is about managing the liabilities, particularly those that emerge and explode in an increasingly free market of work. This takes about 20 minutes. And then, of course, the company that did this, that introduced this checklist very shortly after, started introducing hot desking, which, by the way, with COVID-19 is an exceedingly bad idea. So that has been, well, nobody sits at their desk to begin with. For most people, don't work at their desks currently. But sharing desks is considered a bad idea now. So that'll stop for another reason. But doing hot desking and a desk checklist means that you are wasting at least 20 minutes every day of every worker in order to, every desk worker, to meet this compliance demand, which then needs to be signed off by the safety manager and the safety director, and then goes into some HR database, so as to manage the liabilities of any claims that you might want to come up with. It is this utter idiocy, right, and this focus on very narrow budgetary demands of a particular stakeholder group inside organizations or a stakeholder swirling around the organization that then irradiates the work and the productivity of everyone else that fires me up sufficiently to write a damn book about it. This is another example, right? No country is immune to the idiocies of these sorts of things, right? So these guys got suspended for transporting an 18-month-old in a fire engine because the appropriate safety devices for transporting an 18-year-old were not available in that fire engine. You go, really? You don't say. And so if it's your 18-month-old, do you really care? Again, it's these idiocies of strict compliance that get in the way of getting stuff done and getting it safely and creating good outcomes that I find morally problematic. When you look at healthcare, which of course is under beautiful scrutiny today, Jeffrey Braithwaite down at Macquarie University asked ward nurses how many rules they need to follow every day. And his team stopped counting at 600, right? 600 rules. Now, then they asked, so nurse, can you recite back to me some of those 600 rules? Yeah, they could. And then they stopped between 2 and 3 rules. That's all they could give back. There's 2 or 3. Let me give you, it's healthcare. It's probably something about hand washing. Certainly now. There's probably something about not propping open in a fire exit. There's probably something about, there's a drug protocol for pediatric patients. Yeah, we got that too. Let me tell you about that. But then after that, they run dry. So 597 rules aren't even stable in the heads of the people who are supposed to comply with them. Now, when you look at, of course, things like native resilience, Alberti's beautiful term, it may well be the case that that they comply naturally with a lot of these rules, but that having someone make these rules doesn't mean anything for their workplaces. So, but I think the point is made. It's always possible to write more rules. You can always write more rules. There's no limit to it, but you can never close the gap between the rules you write and how work actually gets done, simply because the world is a complex, dynamic place, all right? There was a time when it perhaps wasn't in a Tayloristic workplace, right, where there was hardly a gap between work is imagined and work is done. But in the world where the gap between work is imagined and work is done is always there and pretty big, writing more rules and demanding more compliance is not a solution. So what are some of the results that you get? Well, Hannah Arendt actually, who of course wrote about Eichmann in Jerusalem and went through the Holocaust, and wrote this about totalitarianism. And interestingly, you can recognize these three features of what happens to a population under totalitarianism in some of our regimes of safety management today. The first is optic compliance, right? And this comes straight out of Hannah Arendt, right? Optic compliance. You do as if you comply as long as you know that somebody's looking, or as long as the consequences matter for you, right? Well, under certain totalitarian regimes, those consequences matter in terms of life and death. That's not the case with many of the safety rules, right? Do not walk under a suspended load. Is there a camera? Right? The second one, she says, is resignation. Resignation, in this case, doesn't mean you resign from your job. No, resignation means that you basically resign yourself to the fact that there's more of this stuff coming down the pike, that you now have a checklist for this, that, and the other thing, and that there really is nothing that you can do about it to change it. That means resignation. So you resign, you reconcile to the notion that you have no influence over these things. And then she says cynicism. And cynicism here would mean that you have stopped believing that any of it is for the good of yourself. And this happens under totalitarian regimes as well, right? Optic compliance, resignation, and cynicism. Now, interesting, in a conversation with a whole lecture theater, when this was still happening, of safety professionals, do you know that this is what they describe their job as to me and their experience of their job? That they feel that they are under a regime of optic compliance, of resignation, and of cynicism, right? So they do as if they stick with what their organization wants them to do. They are resigned to the fact that they cannot change that, and they become cynical about it having any positive influence for the people it is supposed to impact. Now, it seems a really strange pact to have entered into without perhaps us realizing that this is what we're doing with and to each other in the accountability relationships that we've created. And so that was really my purpose with the Safety Anarchist, and in fact, work that's now following up on that other work that I might give you a hint at in a moment. But let me just give you an example of that cynicism, right? Everybody will have seen things like this in their workplace, I presume. Right? Now, if this is not an indication of cynicism, again, one of these little anthropological outcroppings in a workplace that, if you are really interested in what goes on there, should get you to ask further questions, right? And then, of course, somebody thinks that they can top even that one, right? So that is cynicism. It's not resignation. Well, perhaps it represents resignation as much as cynicism, but it certainly is cynicism, right? People have stopped believing that anything that you say about this, right? Look, we are achieving zero, is helping anything, and it's not for them. So, so why, of course, the Safety Anarchist asks, do we have such huge safety bureaucracies? Now, it's easy to point, interestingly, to increasing regulation as one of the contributors, but in itself, it actually doesn't play a major role any longer, and I'll get back to that. A stronger role is played by deregulation, quite paradoxically. And I'll talk about that in a second. Of course, since the World War, the Second World War, there has been significantly increasing regulation. But when you look at the first to say 3 decades of that, there was the inflection of regulation and the inflection of fatalities and workplace accidents and disasters. They've moved together. Right, and so increasing regulation is actually having an effect, right? And you can even see some of this back in the 30s on the back of the work of dare I say, Heinrich, who tried to illustrate that, you know, if you harm people in your factory, that actually comes from somewhere. Right? You can design stuff in a way that it doesn't fly around in a way that can kill them. So let's think about that. Right? Of course, he worked for an insurance company that had an active stake in not having to pay out claims. So anything he could do to help organizations not kill their people or destroy their factory was a good thing for his company. So increasing regulation so only has a little bit of a role to play. So deregulation, we'll get back to that. The concerns around liability have a huge role to play, and the more neoliberal we become, the more we've created free markets. As you see over the past 20 years particularly, and indeed the history is about 40 years of that trend, but the last 20 years particularly, the more we get concerned about liability, the more we enter into in principle agent relationships where there is an accountability and money, the more we get concerned about closing that off by nailing shut the various holes through which safety risks can supposedly flow. And then we think we can fix that by putting up posters in workplaces, telling people to be more careful. The explosion of contracting, right, which in itself is, of course, an effect of the way in which we've changed the governance of free markets, creating a lot of, again, principals and agents. If you contract out most of your work, you need bureaucracies to administer it all. And that in itself creates a lot of bureaucracy. Surveillance technologies are another reason why we have more safety bureaucracy. Say that you have a intelligent vehicle monitoring system, right? And so you monitor what happens to the vehicles that your company owns, and you got lone workers going out. Well, if that vehicle produces data, you got to do something with that data. You might contract it out, but that again creates a bureaucratic relationship and more bureaucracy in the contractor who needs to do something with all that data. What if you let a drone fly over your mine site to go count hard hats, right? By the way, and I've seen this happen. Right? Are they wearing the hard hats? I mean, really cute. But if ever there was an image of, you know, of safety helicopter parenting, then literally that's what's going on right there, right? So, okay, you get the footage, you have results from your flying around. What do you do with it? Well, you need a bureaucratic back apparatus for that to accommodate those data. So surveillance technologies in themselves create the need for and supply the data into additional bureaucracy. Certification is an important one. Becoming ISO compliant, for example, can take 2 years of an organization's work, and then, as I've heard, it takes another 2 years to dismantle the nonsense that you've built up around some of it. And sociology, final reason, indicates that there is something like bureaucratic entrepreneurism, which is a beautiful word that suggests very strongly that, you know, bureaucracies are entrepreneurial. They want to stay at work. Bureaucrats want to stay at work. And in a COVID-19 crisis, perhaps they are the only ones who still do stay at work because there's a looser relationship between revenue and job security than in many other jobs. But they will find areas to colonize, right? And there's a little literature on this in sociology that's quite nicely describing how that works. They'll find areas to colonize, write rules for them, and then they get to, of course, patrol and police that and compel compliance. So bureaucratic entrepreneurism. So those are just some reasons. Now, I said that since we have made the shift in the 1980s in at least Anglo countries, and others followed suit since then, to more market-driven policies, you see a significant increase in compliance pressure rather than a decrease. And that demands an explanation, right? So a piece of work was just submitted to the International Journal of Organizational Analysis to suggest why that is so. And what you find, what the research shows, is there's at least 4 factors that are intertwined that can help explain why free markets create more compliance pressure rather than less compliance pressure. Part of it goes back to Buchanan's work in the 1970s, even predating neoliberalism and those sort of market-oriented policy reforms, that shows already that competition and corporate governance creates the conditions for people to be subject to more rules and more stringent compliance than government workers. And they found that, for example, in say Kaufman's work, also in the 70s, on forest rangers in the U.S., he looked at 792 forest rangers in the U.S. with a wide latitude of interpreting their mandates. Absolutely no way to get in touch with any hierarchical structure because they're on a horse out in Wyoming somewhere, right, patrolling somebody who's fishing illegally or whatever it is that they do. And interestingly, despite the fact that they're not able to communicate, right, and sometimes they're able to horizontally coordinate with their colleagues, sure, that happened, they instill in themselves these professional values and the sort of institutionalized commitments of the organization they work for. And they were able to have a remarkably consistent policy environment in their jurisdictions without a lot of coordination. It's actually a really interesting piece of work. That is not easy to replicate in an organization that has a very strict mission and a commercial revenue model attached to it. So that's one explanation people come up with. The second one is, of course, the audit explosion, right? The word by Power, work from the 1990s. Why do we have an audit explosion? Simply, he explains, because once you free up markets, you create many, 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 many more principal-agent relationships and thus accountability relationships that somehow need to be accounted for. Audits have become the go-to solution to do that. If you do more auditing, you create a lot more compliance demands, right? And we all know the severe and deep limits associated with auditing, how easy it is to pass a green audit, how incredibly time-robbing they are to begin with, and how it is impossible to discover anything new or to create any surprise in an audit. I would be, in fact, fascinated to learn whether any of you have been surprised in the last 5 years by an audit finding. I said, "Ooh, I never expected that." Another reason is a tenure system in a government organization as opposed to private organizations, and systems of appeal and whistleblowing that are generally better protected than under corporate governance. And so these are not my explanation. This is what the literature tells us about it, right? Try to explain, why do we have more compliance demands once you go private, as opposed to when you let a government run these things. More systems of appeal as a result of that, and better protected generally. The research results that you see from Amy Edmondson, for example, and why is her work wildly popular right now? Amy Edmondson, Psychological Safety, right? Why a book on how to encourage people to speak up and feel safe to speak up in private organizations. The market for it is huge because we've managed to shut most of it down, right? And the figures are really quite daunting. Even in IT, when you look, some of the big tech companies speaking up, 50%, 80%, depending on which company you ask, will say, no, I don't think I'll bring that type of concern to my boss. Growth of compliance workforce, and beautifully a new market for safety bureaucracy. Now, let me just give you some figures for the last one. You create a market, right? Everything works if the market works. Well, certainly if you're a safety company, look at the number of safety professionals in Australia alone over that period of 20 years. It sort of quadruples. And then safety companies in the world. These are the latest figures that I could find, but 2009, it had doubled from only 3 years before, right? In a piece of work with Norwegian colleagues, we were interviewing a ship's captain, and it's amazing how many working in safety, how many lectures we've been to and listened to about the world is able to survive if we don't have all these safety companies. It surely has become an industry, right? And that's just a recipient. You create this, you create a market for a compliance marketplace, right? So Dave Proven.
Sidney,
Yeah.
I'm gonna jump in here for a question. They're starting to pile up a little bit here. So I have a question from Arthur asking about, hi Sid, you said some compliance is good. What type of compliance is good, and how do you differentiate between good and bad compliance?
Ask the people whom you're asking to comply. It's that simple as that. You know, defer to expertise. Ask the front line. Anything. Well, but that would be the policy guidance. I think the criterion for what is good versus bad compliance is anything that decreases adaptive capacity on the front line. And that creates, as Dave Woods would say, brittleness instead of nimbleness and adaptive capacity, would be bad compliance. Anything that increases adaptive capacity on the front line would theoretically be good compliance. So I hope that's an answer to Arthur's question.
That sounds great. And Tony also says, how do you feel about line managers spending time regularly on the shop floor to observe work practices, work is done, and work conditions, integrity of defenses, resources, error traps, etc., for the purpose of better understanding the impact of system and organizational factors?
It's key, Tony, it's key. Absolutely, it's key. There's a couple of things to note there, though. Just being there to observe is not enough, you know, because this is something. I mean, this wouldn't be novel out of this work. In fact, right, even dare I say, DuPont, you know, with field leadership, try to instill that sort of value in leaders as well. But going in and watching the wolves mate from a distance, particularly if it is very clear that you are a hierarchical figure when you're watching, is not going to yield anything productive. I was in one organization where orange overalls were supposed to be worn by those on the front line. If managers came in, or line managers came in to do just that, they put on an overall, which were much cleaner than the overalls that the frontline people were wearing, and the anthropological outcropping in this case was that oh, here come the carrots. Had become the characterization of workers to say, oh, here's the line manager watching again, right? Here come the carrots. If there's any indication of cynicism, resignation, of the utter lack of credibility of that, then it would be that example. Now, that doesn't mean that it's not a good idea. It is a good idea, but a couple of conditions, right? The first is, perhaps rather than just watching work, is actually do work, and in an undercover boss type of way, though not undercover, because that would be impractical. And probably if you do that, we thought about that with the embedded discovery that we developed after I did this with Qantas and Woolworths and other organizations. Unions don't like it at all, and so that's to the extent that there are unions in the workplaces that you work, that might get you in trouble. But the other thing is, you have to be so you have to win the trust, right, of the people you're working with, to do that well. Doing the work that they do is a great way to win that trust. And I'm sure, as Dave, who's on the call, Dave Proven, would be able to attest, people are really happy to talk about their work. Right? Most people really want to talk about their work, but you got to ask the right sorts of questions, right? The question I was going to suggest to you is, what is the stupidest thing that I'm asking you to work here today? Right? You begin with that question. What's the stupidest thing that I am asking you to do to work here today? Rather than asking questions about, so, how do you ensure safety? I mean, that's nanny-ish, and it's not going to get the conversation going. So finally, Tony, the important criterion for this to work is for you to be able to do something with that information. Right? Once you've learned something interesting, once you've seen a big gap between work is done versus work is imagined, what do you do? Is there any way you can go up with that, or back down horizontally, coordinate better ways of working and say, okay, which rule are we going to throw out because clearly it's not working? So you have to be able to do something with the information you gather. Now, there's other ways to do this. You can do learning reviews where you sit people down and talk about either an incident or a thing that went really well, or just a normal work day, and say what made it hard, what made it easy, right? What were the obstacles? And so there's methods around this. that can nicely and I think pretty faithfully replicate you actually having to go in there and do the work yourself. But I'm sure lots of people are biting their tongues on the call right now saying, oh, but we're doing versions of this and we have ideas about this. And so we only have an hour, but there's, Laura, back to you.
Okay, we have one more question, I guess, from Richard, and then we'll let you carry on for another little bit. Should we feel guilty or like we're part of the problem, even though we're part of the woke safety professionals?
Can you unmute Dave and let him answer that question? Dave Provan.
Yes. Potentially not.
Okay, that's no good.
That's
no good. In the meantime, does he have to? Okay. Well, so Richard, I can come back and.
Oh, I got him. I got him.
Got it.
Dave Provan, you should be unmuted.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Good morning. Look, I think very quickly, I'd say we probably should feel guilty if we're not doing something with the fact that we feel woke about this situation. And recently, I was in a room with 90 or 100 people, and I asked everyone to put their hand up if they felt like reporting minor incident statistics was a good thing for safety. And everyone in the room, clearly, every single person said it wasn't a good idea. And I said, who's actually had that conversation with their organisation? And only half the people had. So being woke is not the important thing. Doing something about it is.
Good.
Great answer.
Good. So yeah, don't feel guilty for being part of the system, but feel guilty if you don't capitalize on being part of the system by changing it from the inside out. Fair enough. Fair enough. So Dave, in this paper, obviously, right, asks, are we busy with the work of safety or the safety of work? And I think that's a really important question to ask yourselves, right? Because one is useful, the other isn't. All right, so, okay, but then does a safety anarchist say, all right, let's throw out the rules, you know, like Edison, hell, there's no rules here, we're trying to accomplish something. Now, I don't know whether there's anybody from GE on the call, but I bet my boots that GE today is an organization that has lots of compliance demands, and that Edison might go, oh my God, that's a lot of rules. So I'm not necessarily advocating that. We have to be nuanced and subtle about this, right? There are worlds and where safety is such an issue where more rules could actually really help make it better. And so Himalaya mountaineering is one of those worlds, right? And so I'm going off of some of the work by René Amalperti, but you know, if this is your death rate, then having an access rule, which you know in a marketized place is not possible because there's money to be made of locals who guide you up, and so entrance controls and making rules around that are not necessarily practicable. But in principle, that would save lives in a world where you kill basically 10 to the -1, right? So this is a large graph, but you know, driven by the work of Amalperti. The basic idea is this: the safer you become, not only the larger the distance becomes between how work is imagined versus work is done, perhaps, but importantly, the way you injure people is no longer the way you kill people, right? Which, apropos the remark that Dave Provan just made, right? Whereas when you injure yourself on the Himalayas, that's probably how you get killed. In fact, you probably die because you get injured. So there is a pretty strong overlap there, right? The safer you become, the less that is the case. And the more difficult it becomes to write rules to create greater safety, right? So if you go from left to right in this representation, the more useless it becomes to turn to bureaucracy to create greater safety. That's a very shorthand of some of Amalperti's work, right? Everybody, I hope on the call knows the difference between work is imagined and work is done, right? Because you will have been familiar with some of Eric Holnagel's work. So I won't talk too long about this. Dave Weber, my PhD student, time took this picture. This is pretty much work is imagined because the project manager is standing, or project director is standing right next to David as he's taking the picture. You see the guy is pushing a pipe underground. to stand a sewer. And he's all hooked up on a tripod, and which is problematic anyway because the tripod can shift. So they've put some stuff against the legs to stop it from shifting. The tripod is probably not even in the right place, but he's sort of compliant, right? When the boss walks off, they go, all right, let's get some stuff done, right? And the pipe goes in the ground 2.5 times quicker this way, right? So there's many more details in this picture that we could spend hours on, but the basic image, all right, of work is imagined versus work is done is pretty clear. Also, that work is imagined and work as sort of compliant introduces risks that were unintended to begin with, like musculature issues and tripods falling on top of you and all those issues. So if that's the case, then is this a safety anarchist, right? Warning, to avoid serious injury, don't tell me how to do my job. I saw this on the undercarriage of an aircraft in one of the hangars I was in, so I thought that was pretty cool. You wonder who sticks it there. Hey, but is that what safety anarchism is about? Well, in order to answer that question, we got to first understand the difference between anarchy and anarchism. So anarchy is a state of affairs, whereas anarchism is a set of ideas and ideals. Very different situation. And in fact, historically, when you study anarchy, not anarchism, I mean, we'll talk about it in a second, but when you study anarchy, anarchy typically follows on a regime of repression and totalitarian control. That's when you get anarchy. Right? And so actually imposing more strict hierarchical control on a populace creates the conditions for anarchy. Leaderless chaos, disorder, non-recognition of any authority. And recognize that anarchism isn't a non-recognition of any authority. It recognizes authority in expertise, right? And frontline work. That's where the authority is to say how things should be done. Right? So there is a recognition of authority. There's a recognition in asking those who know what they're doing. And again, that's not a novel finding either. Hell, even the high reliability guys in the 1970s indicated that that was a key component of organizations becoming highly reliable, right? Deference to expertise and lawlessness. So the set of ideas and ideals of anarchism, and again, these are essentially ideas from particularly the 19th century, inspired by watchmakers in Switzerland, by international mail, right? Completely horizontally coordinated system without hierarchical control, without any hierarchical coordination, right? No top-down authority. The interesting thing about anarchism is the possibility for disruption of protocol and starting to do things different, precisely because of the lack of top-down control and the ability to try things locally because you are horizontally coordinated and then spread that idea. Even Kaufman saw this in the 70s among forest rangers. Hey, we tried this there, it really worked. Oh, interesting. So when you look at the ideas of complexity science and anarchism, there's actually a lot of theoretical affinity and practical affinity, right? This square in the Netherlands that features in the film Safety Differently that I hope you've seen, in fact, embodies the features of complexity science and anarchism all at once. No central authority, right? There is no central authority in traffic lights or few signs, but other than that, hardly any central authority present in that or represented in that square. It's an open system. Anybody can come in, right? Order emerges from horizontal interactions between the blue van and the little old lady, right? The blue van is not going to go faster than the little old lady until they're past the little old lady. Nobody's telling them to do this. There is no central authority from the top down imposing that rule, yet it emerges, right, from the horizontal interactions between the players in that square. You get innovation and novelty. You get novel solutions that start to congeal and become good ideas within that situation that could never have been made up by a central authority. You get feedback loops. I'd suppress ineffective ones. And of course, completely consistent with complexity science, you could not derive the equation set for the traffic movements in this square. You would run out of mathematical capacity very quickly. So the question I asked Tony is right here, right? What is the stupidest thing that you need to do to work here today? If we start asking that, I think we're already one step further to becoming a safety anarchist. Now, again, if we go back to Edison, though, does that mean that we throw out all the rules? If people come back to, oh, this and this and this and this, oh, yeah, let's throw it out. No, not necessarily. And if you look closely at the square, you can see that not all the rules are being thrown out either, right? The basic traffic rules, right and traffic has right of way, for example, or there's a general speed limit that applies to the center of the town, that all of a sudden the square doesn't obviate, right? So these things still apply. You could make the distinction between these need to have and nice to have, right? This must have and your call. Resilience, in this case, being the ability to recognize, adapt to harmful influences, and freeing that capacity up. Versus having the framework around what people need to do. So I think part of what a safety anarchist would be advocating is this freedom in a frame. The thing is that we've lost the sense and the importance of that freedom, right? The adaptive capacity at the front line, and to make sure that we do everything to enhance that adaptive capacity at the front line within the frame of rules and standards, and for example, even mechanical constraints on the system that won't go faster or accommodate more traffic or whatever it is. We still need to take those into account because the world is still there, right? So, but freedom in a frame. Now, how do you get that? I think these are the questions that you would want to be asking as a safety anarchist, right? Declutter. You decentralize and devolve. And when you look at the work in the film, for example, in the Woolworths experiment, that's exactly what we did, right? Which rule can you do without? And there are rules you can do without. I promise you that your organization or the one you work with has rules you can do without. A refinery that has some of you may remember, has a how to clean up a dead pigeon procedure that takes 2 pages, right? And sits in a bureaucratic system that gets administered. You can really do without. Right. How do you decentralize? Decentralize means you take it from headquarters and send it out to the organization actually doing the job, right? A contractor needs to be able to decide whether to abandon work under certain weather conditions without headquarters having to butt in on that decision, right? Why? You don't know what the local conditions are. And so decentralize that. Once it's decentralized, and it is with the organization that does the work, then you devolve, which doesn't mean getting rid of Scotland. It means devolution, means pushing it down as close to the front line as you can, because that is where decision authority needs to sit. Laura, you got more questions? I got more to say, but I'm sure there's more questions.
Yeah, you bet. So Heather, related to what we're talking about right now, is asking about, is it the case that the protocol gets you to a certain level of safety, but then to increase reliability, you need to release those rules? How does that work in practice? So you've given some good examples here, but do you have any comments on protocols providing a certain level of safety?
Yeah, it is not as simple as that, but Heather, thank you for the question. I would very much suggest you read Amalberti's book, where he talks about it's the title of the book is like half a cover long. So, but he talks about managed versus controlled safety. This is the basis for his later work on native resilience, right? And of course, native resilience is that which we're talking about in that freedom to act and have adaptive capacity at the front line. Now, are there some protocols that can guarantee safety versus, okay. If you go back to the original high reliability work, right, the Northern Californians back in the 70s, they're going out to these aircraft carriers and finding, how is it possible that they don't kill more people, right, as if that would be a standard for how many they should be killing, but never mind. And of course, as you know, probably from that work, one of the things that they found was that the introduction of, for example, the Tomcat, right, this big fighter jet, like a 30-ton jet, onto the deck, had no rules. They introduced this jet without any rules. Now you could come back and say, oh, there's still a protocol for how to fly a jet, right, or how to work things on the deck, and so those protocols probably were in place and were working. But the actual introduction of that airplane had no rules accompanying it. The rules only followed practice. And so you could make the argument that there is probably no protocol-less world, right? So there's always some protocol. But again, I think the important question is who gets to say, right? Who gets to say which protocol matters and which one doesn't, right? And I'm sure that lots of people on the call have examples from their own organization where they say, well, hang on, without this being set in stone, right, this particular protocol, we would not be able to work safely. I think, and Dave Wood says this beautifully, I think, right, he doesn't say it this way, but there's always a scale, right? We always make sacrifices relative to the rules and the constraints that are put on us. The question is, which sacrifices matter and which ones don't matter, right? And tell you what, Laura, in order to answer as well, let me skip ahead and go to Nick, right? Because Nick is working in a workplace where there's nothing that can fall on his head, except the beams ahead, but why would you walk under those? Because there's other things preventing him from doing that. But he's got to wear the hard hat. Now, again, a little anthropological outcropping I found on his hard hat was this GSD at the back of his hard hat, right? And some of you will have seen this example. But to me, he's the perfect embodiment of this freedom in the frame safety anarchist, because the GSD, I was told by the guy whom I walked next to, means get shit done. All right, that's what he's got on the back of his hard hat. Mr. Get Shit Done. Now, in order to get shit done, he has to make sacrifices. Some of these matter, some of them don't matter, right? When flying the 737, the security checklist is a sacrifice that I think most pilots would be happy to make, because it's a paper tiger, it means very little, right? And it's just a signature underneath a piece of work that you haven't really been able to guarantee anyway, right? Yeah, we don't have a stowaway or Semtex packages in our baggage hold. Well, the doors are still open, right? So how do you know? That would be an easy, the last thing you want to sacrifice is probably your radio comms or the other pilot, because it's a 2-pilot airplane, right? It's a bad idea you can't fly by yourself. It's a lot of work, right? So, and it's an emergency situation. So some sacrifices matter, some don't. So I don't think, and this is what I'm trying to say, I don't think there is a very clear separation between, oh, this is protocol, that saves your life, this is irrelevant, let's throw it out. It depends, and it really requires intimate insight into how work is done, how safe work is created, how normally successful work is created, which in Nick's case is obviously important, right? If you want to predict fatalities in this workplace, apropos what Dave was saying about reporting minor incidents, then looking at your minor incidents is absolutely useless. It will yield no insight whatsoever. What is going to be yielding insight is you following Nick and understanding what the sacrifices are that get made on a daily basis, which protocol violations get made, which matter, which don't matter, and which are necessary to make to get shit done, to get work done. That's the way in which your organization can start to predict where things are going to go really badly one day, by you understanding normal success, right? You got to understand normal success. Then you can understand how people might get in trouble, how the system might get in trouble. Sorry, Laura, long answer. Sorry, back to you.
Oh, great questions. So we have about another 8 minutes left. The questions are coming in fast and furious. I wanted to give you, Sidney, an opportunity if there's points in your slide deck that you want to make, and then, or if that's the point, we can continue on with the questions.
Well, that's really cute. All right. The point I was making is, all right, is exactly this. This would be useful. What we've seen, the research shows this quite nicely, is that fatalities and high potentials don't happen in a way that's predicted by incidents. Not in workplaces on the right hand of Amonberti's system, right? They happen at work. That may be hard, but that is still successful. You have to understand how success is created. If you don't, right, then what becomes predictive of a fatality is normally successful work that you haven't understood, right? And that seems to connect all of the fatalities and high potential incidents and accidents that at least my lab has been involved in investigating. So, all right. So then what do we, let's not worry about this. So yeah, well, here's the distinction between the anarchist, the compliant, the anarchist, right? People are problem to control. No, they're problem solvers. Let them do their work. No, we got to tell them what to do. No. Rather than tell them what to do, ask them what they need. Count and reduce negative events, that's a bad idea, right? Instead, understand why things normally succeed. Safety is an absence of negative events. No, it isn't. That's, of course, a whole Nagelian point, right? It is the presence of capacities that make things go well. Let's invest in understanding what those capacities are and enhance the adaptive capacity of people on the front line to make things go well. I'll leave this on, Laura, and more questions.
That's great. So Brad is asking, how does a safety professional find the line between promoting safety anarchism and being exposed to liability themselves, or exposing the organization to liability?
Thanks, Brad. Yeah, it's an important question. So one of the things that we're doing, obviously, and that you saw some of the things fly by, is talk about a capacity index, right? So one of the things that that we have found in all the work that we've done is that actually most regulators don't specify a lot of the things that they want you to do, right? As I said, 3 out of 5 rules that are related to safety now come from the organization itself, rather than from the government or a regulator or an inspectorate. And so what that allows you to do is to actually become more creative and open-minded about what the regulator asks you. For example, the regulator might come back and say, we need this organization to have a safety management system. You go, oh, okay. But they're not necessarily telling you what's in it. If you then make 500 pages of promises of what's going to be in it, of course they're going to hold you to it, but that is your choice, right? So you can be relatively anarchistic in terms of how you interpret that. And that gives you the ability to negotiate the amount of compliance that you're going to create for your people. And so, which doesn't get you into legal trouble. If you then want to give the board of your organization or even the regulator and the inspectorate the assurance that you know what you're doing, the way to do that is not to show low numbers of negatives, is not to show big numbers of rules, because none of that is convincing, and we know it isn't, right? What is convincing is that you are investing in the capacity of your people to make things go right. And so this work has just been submitted to the International Labor Review, a slightly more up-to-date copy than this one. But in fact, just yesterday, for a capacity index, right? So how do you create capacity in your people to anticipate, to have the resources available, the capacity to monitor, right? And to monitor your monitoring, so you know how effective your monitoring is, capacity for assurance, capacity to learn. When you look at the types of ways in which we get into liability trouble, it is that you're not able to show this, right? You didn't have the capacity to learn. You didn't have the capacity to monitor. So if we can flip it and say, we can actually show you that we are compliant in terms of the input values that we have to make things go well, you can be an anarchist and stay out of legal trouble all at the same time. Back to you, Laura.
Okay, great. Andrew is asking, hi, Sidney, when you refer to safety not being a bureaucratic activity, but an ethical responsibility, could you elaborate on your meaning?
Thanks, Andrew. What I was mostly concerned about is that, and Dave Proven will be able to back this up on the basis of the research he has done, a lot of the work of safety is about the recording and the reporting that then gets sent upstairs. And there's a great concern around the numbers looking good. In fact, somebody in the oil and gas industry told me that they're not worried about the LTI, they're worried about the LGI, right? And some of you will know this, the looking good index. Right. And again, if people start using those terms, the looking good index, then that indicates that safety is a bureaucratic activity that is organized around showing good numbers up the hierarchy in order to keep out of trouble. Right. And the hierarchy itself uses those good numbers, increasingly distant from what actually happens in the operation, obviously, and increasingly irrelevant as to any predictive capacity or whether you're going to blow up your rig in the night. Apropos Macondo, right? 2 weeks ago, anniversary. So that's the idea. Safety as, now, if you want to change safety to an ethical responsibility, an accountability is mostly something that happens up, right? And you are accountable to, and that mostly happens up in a hierarchical system. You are responsible for, and that mostly happens down or around you, right? If you're responsible for, that creates a very different relationship than something that you're accountable to. All right, so hence the responsible for, accountable to type of distinction that I wanted to make. Laura.
Okay, I think this might be our last question here. With no central authority, wouldn't we start running into problems of people working together creatively when populations get larger and more dense? The tragedy of the commons, in essence, and wouldn't that apply to safety practices?
Very likely. And so the complexity of organizations themselves challenges this notion. Um, I think the answer to that lies in, and so yes, this it will take a lot more time to treat this one fairly, and I think it's a very good question. Who asked it?
Catherine Hilst.
Thanks, Kath. It's a very good question. The recommendation is read the book if you haven't yet, and let's think about how that was solved in some other situations related to anarchism. But the sheer growth of organizations and their complexity itself has often been used as an argument to allow for more bureaucracy. The other argument associated with this is which Amy Edmondson uses, I think, quite nicely, and that is that horizontally coordinated teams can descend into a situation in which there is, as she puts it in a very North American way, no accountability. And so they do great stuff, they're having a great time, they're being innovative, but none of what they do is really useful. And so how do you hold them accountable in ways that is productive for the organization's mission? These are questions that certainly arise when we tiptoe into this area. So I validate the questions and need more time for sophisticated answers with you. So you can hunt me down in other ways, perhaps, Kath, but thank you for the question.
And time is unfortunately something that we are out of. So thank you so much, Sidney. That was very thought-provoking. And of course, we deeply appreciate both your time and your insight and all of the effort that you've done to move the safety profession forward. As I mentioned, this recording will go up on the Resilience Engineering Association's website. As well, we'll capture the full scope of the questions that have been asked. The ones we were able to ask were just a small amount of all of the insight that you all had. And just a quick note that the next COVID series webinar will be on May 11th, and that will be looking at naturalistic decision-making and resilience engineering. For the regular series of webinars, our next session is on June 1st with Eder Henriksen from Brazil, and we'll be talking about challenges and opportunities of integrating resilience into an offshore oil and gas platform. So we hope that you will join us for both of those, and thank you very much for your time today, everyone. Take care.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you.